Notes of Some Wanderings, The Shrine of Amarnath by Sister Nivedita. On Tuesday, August the 2nd, the great day of Amarnath, the first batch of pilgrims must have left the camp at 2. We left by the light of the full moon. The sun rose as we went down the narrow valley. It was not too safe at this part of the journey, but when we left our dundies and began to climb, the real danger began. A sort of goat path in almost vertical hillsides, becoming in the descent on the other side, a tiny staircase in the turf. Every here and there, delicate columbines, Michaelmas daisies, and wild roses tempted one to risk life and limb in their acquisition. Then, having at last reached the bottom of the farther slope, we had to toil along the glacier, mile after mile to the cave. About a mile before our destination, the ice ceased, and in the flowing water, the pilgrims had to bathe. Even when we seemed to have arrived, there was still quite a stiff ascent over the rocks to be made. The Swami, exhausted, had by this time fallen behind, but I, not remembering that he might be ill, waited below the banks of gravel for his appearance. He came at last, and with a word sent me on. He was going to bathe. Half an hour later, he entered the cave. With a smile, he knelt, first at one end of the semicircle, then at the other. The place was vast, large enough to hold a cathedral, and the great ice Shiva, in a nick of deepest shadow, seemed as if throned on its own base. A few minutes passed, and then he turned to leave the cave. To him, the heavens had opened. He had touched the feet of Shiva. He had to hold himself tight, he said afterwards, lest he should swoon away. But so great was his physical exhaustion that a doctor said afterwards that his heart ought to have stopped beating and had undergone a permanent enlargement instead. How strangely near fulfillment had been those words of his master. When he realizes who and what he is, he will give up this body. I have enjoyed it so much, he said half an hour afterwards, as he sat on a rock above the stream side, eating lunch with the kind naked Swami and myself. I thought the ice lingam was Shiva himself, and there were no thievish Brahmins, no trade, nothing wrong. It was all worship. I never enjoyed any religious place so much. Afterwards, he would often tell of the overwhelming vision that had seemed to draw him almost into its vortex. He would talk of the poetry of the white ice pillar, and it was he who suggested that the first discovery of the place had been by a party of shepherds who had wandered far in search of their flocks one summer day and had entered the cave to find themselves before the unmelting ice in the presence of the Lord Himself. He always said, too, that the grace of Amarnath had been granted to him there, not to die till he himself should give consent. And to me, he said, you do not now understand, but you have made the pilgrimage and it will go on working. Causes must bring their effects. You will understand better afterwards. The effects will come. How beautiful was the road by which we returned next morning to Pahalgam. We struck tents that night immediately on our return to them and camped later for the night in a snowy pass a whole stage further on. We paid a coolie a few annas here to push on with a letter, but when we actually arrived next afternoon, we found that this had been quite unnecessary, for all morning long relays of pilgrims had been passing the tents and dropping in the most friendly manner to give the others news of us and our impending arrival. In the morning, we were up and on the way long before dawn. As the sun rose before us, while the moon went down behind, we passed above the lake of death, into which about 40 pilgrims had been buried one year by an avalanche which their hymns had started. After this, we came to the tiny goat path down the face of a steep cliff by which we were able to shorten the return journey so much. This was little better than a scramble, and every one had perforce to do it on foot. At the bottom, the villagers had something like breakfast ready. Fires were burning, chapatis baking, and tea ready to be served out. From this time on, parties of pilgrims would leave the main body at each parting of the ways, and the feeling of solidarity that had grown up amongst us all throughout the journey became gradually less and less. That evening, on the knoll above Pahalgam, where a great fire of pine logs was lighted and daris spread, we all sat and talked. Our friend, the naked Swami, joined us, and we had plenty of fun. But presently, when all had gone, save our own little party, we sat on, with the great moon overhead, and the towering snows, and rushing river, and the mountain pines, and the Swami talked of Shiva, and the cave, and the great verge of vision.